Now, a UN agency, UNRWA, have confirmed that the Hamas leader in Lebanon, who was killed over the weekend, was in fact one of their employees. I know. We're all surprised by that, aren't we? And this is Fatah al-Sharif. He was a member of staff. He was the Hamas, one of the Hamas leaders, the Hamas leader in Lebanon. They've got a lot of different leaders, as we know. And, of course, Sinwar still holed up, we understand, with hostages surrounding him in handcuffs in a tunnel somewhere in southern Gaza. He's the next on the kill list, I believe, but there we are. Let's talk right now about, well, what's coming up, that anniversary next Monday, October the 7th, the anniversary of that horrific massacre, the worst massacre, the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust in the Second World War. Well, one person who has been standing by the Jewish people, the Israeli people's side, throughout has been Brendon O'Neill, chief political writer at Spiked Online. He's been on the show a number of times, as you will know, big friend of the show. He's got a brand new book out. It's called After the Pogrom. It's a new book. It's 7th of October, Israel and the Crisis of Civilization. And I'm delighted to say that Brendon O'Neill joins us right now. Good morning to you, Brendon.
Hi, Julia.
Thank you so much for joining us. Been reading your book over the weekend, and it's a strange thing to say about something that is so awful and so terrible. It is a rip-roaring read. It's a very easy read. It's a book that I think pretty much everyone under 30 needs to be given to read, to learn a little bit more about the stuff that they are thinking, that they support. And this isn't just looking back at what happened on October the 7th and the reaction in the West. This phrase, the crisis of civilization, is the crux of it, isn't it? It's what the reaction to what Hamas did on October the 7th in the West, the reaction in the West, what that tells us about what a terrible state Western civilization is in. Tell us more.
Exactly, yes. So in the book, I argue that there were two eruptions of barbarism on 7th of October 2023. The first was Hamas's pogrom, which we all saw, the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust. And the second eruption of barbarism was the sympathy for Hamas that we saw across the West, on university campuses, on our streets, in newspaper columns. People were making excuses for what Hamas did. They were offering context, as if there could ever be context to a fascist act like that one. And they were essentially saying that Israel had it coming. So this book is an exploration of what people said, what people did. I'm reminding readers that there are leftists who refer to the pogrom as a day of celebration, that people took to the streets to dance and sing when the pogrom took place. People in London, in Paris, in Berlin, in Sydney, people celebrated on the streets when Jews were killed in southern Israel. And the book looks at what happened and why it happened. And my argument is essentially that our response to 7th of October really proves how far we have drifted from the path of civilization. And that's the thing I think we need to talk about now.
And this is the thing. People forget that when they say, oh, well, the demonstrations, they'd all started, they were all in response to the, quote, war crimes, unquote, of Israel in Gaza. No, people were out on the streets, people were marching, people were, as you say, celebrating, waving flags, cheering on the 7th of October, even as the full horror of what happened in southern Israel was already being made aware to the world on our television screens and online. People were aware at that point what happened. The justification for what happened that day, we still hear it today, and it's fascinating in the contrast with the criticism of Israel's reaction, and we discuss it on the show every day, we're discussing it even today. When Israel acts against Hamas, when Israel acts against Hezbollah, against the Houthi rebels, against Iran, who are funding all of these things and supplying the weaponry, that is a war crime, that is revenge, that is retaliation, that is provocative. BBC used these words. And yet, when, 4,000, was it, Hamas fighters enter Israel to deliberately massacre men, women and children, innocent people, youngsters at a festival, children hiding in a supposedly a safe room, burning them alive, mutilating, raping, murdering and taking 250 hostages. That's placed in historical context. Why do you think there are such different standards applied?
I just think, Israelophobia, as some people refer to it, is out of control. And you're absolutely right. Everything Israel does is referred to as a war crime. If it bombs Gaza, that's a war crime. If it tells people to move out of their communities before it drops its bombs because it doesn't want to kill them, that's a war crime as well. Apparently, that's the crime of forced expulsion. If it kills people, as always happens in wars, that's a war crime. If it tries not to kill people, that's a war crime. Israel can't do anything without armies of people in the West damning it as the most criminal, most genocidal state in the world. So that hatred for Israel, I think, has become really unhinged. And one of the points I make in my book is that there is no moral equivalence whatsoever between what Hamas did on 7th of October and Israel's response. No one will deny that Israel may have made some mistakes in its response, and no one, of course, will deny that civilian death in war is a horror, and it's a horror that happens in every war. Yeah. But what Hamas did on 7th of October, it was a violation of civilization itself. Yeah. It went into Israel with the express intention of killing Jewish women and children and men, and kidnapping grandmothers and slaughtering anyone that it found. It was a modern-day pogrom. The fact that so-called anti-racists in the West made excuses for it still shocks me to this day.
I'm with you. I'm still absolutely shocked by this. But this is the interesting thing, the Israelophobia, the anti-Semitism. Again, I think it's perfectly legitimate to criticise Israel, to criticise particular policies, criticise Benjamin Netanyahu. And I'm sure you, like me, have a number of criticisms of Israeli policy over the years, and indeed things they may have done since October the 7th. But that's not the same as giving, certainly not giving any government, I don't even give my own government a free pass on any of these things, but the holding of Israel to a far higher account than we hold our own government, both whether it's at the UN or whether it's people on the streets of London, I find extraordinary. But this is the interesting thing. You talk a lot in the book about sort of Western identitarian politics, about this intersectionalism. Now, this is the stuff that most normal people go about their lives happily trying to know nothing about until it does impact on them. But actually, these are views that have taken over pretty much every public institution and political party in our country, in Europe, certainly the EU, and in America and the Democrats. I mean, wholesale. And there is a massive aspect to the West's reaction to what happened on October the 7th that is rooted in those identitarian politics and the intersectionalism, which has led to this bizarre, perverted alliance somehow that exists now between the woke left and radical Islam. Talk us through that.
It's so extraordinary. It's summed up in the group Queers for Palestine, which is a bunch of, gender fluid and gay kids who essentially support Hamas. If you boil it down, they've made excuses for what Hamas does. Hamas would throw them off the top of a building faster than they could say free Palestine. These people are so clueless. Feminists as well, many feminists, especially intersectional feminists, have failed miserably after the pogrom of 7th of October. They said nothing about the rape of women by Hamas, and in fact, some of them tried to deny it. Do you remember the big story? I cover this in the book. One of the big feminist stories of the past few months was those rich feminists trying to become members of the Garrick Club. Yeah. The opulent Garrick Club.
Power to the people, yeah.
Yeah, that's the great cause for feminism now. In the same weeks that they were doing that, the UN published a report saying, yes, women were raped by Hamas. Yes, there was violations of women's bodies and women's lives, of course. And the feminists said nothing. They were too busy trying to quaff some champagne with rich people in London. Yeah. It was really sickening. The betrayal of womankind in particular after the pogrom was really horrifying. But I think it is a product of identity politics, because when you view all white people as privileged and all brown people as oppressed, and you even interpret a conflict like Israel-Hamas through that prism, people just come to the knee-jerk, completely wrong-headed conclusion that Israel is the oppressor and always will be, and that the Palestinians are incapable of oppression because they are the lesser party in this conflict. So interpreting this war through the prism of identity politics has led people to get it completely wrong and to fail to appreciate the depth of the crime that Hamas committed against the Jewish people on the 7th of October. Identity politics has confused them all.
Well, indeed. Look, identitarian politics confuse most sane people, frankly, because, again, it's just a simplification and judging people by their race, their religion, their gender identity, as opposed to people as individuals. That's how I was raised. Sorry, that makes me apparently a racist now, because I don't see race as the prism through which I see everything through. But a lot of this is tied to this idea of colonialism. I had a guest on last week, just revolutionary communist, so maybe I should have expected this. But, you know, talking about imperialism and colonialism and this view that Israel is this heinous sort of, you know, this carbuncle on the side of civilization that has made everything good about the Middle East wrong. And if only Israel didn't exist, brackets, if only the Jews didn't exist, that everything would be fine. As if like all the stuff we've seen on our screens over the recent decades about what is going on in these horrific, autocratic, despotic, some Islamist extremist regimes in the Middle East has just never happened. I mean, you know, any of these people would think that they could bear to live under the Iranian Ayatollahs or in Saudi, or even, by the way, in Qatar or Dubai. I mean, everyone's saying, oh, isn't Dubai lovely now? I mean, really? Yeah. You try doing something that they're not happy with, or having a bit of free speech. Trust me, you may not want to live there any longer. They absolutely don't see any wrongdoing almost by any Arab state. But anything that Israel does when it puts a foot wrong, and it does put a foot wrong at times, it does. And there will be deaths that didn't need to happen, civilian deaths. But Israel is held to a so much of a higher account, and people are on the streets for the people of Gaza or the people of southern Lebanon, but surprisingly, remarkably unbothered about the people of Syria or Yemen or the Uyghur people in China or anyone else. The women in Iran who have been tortured and brutalised and imprisoned and even killed for simply not wearing a scarf over their head. These people they don't seem to bother them. I wonder why.
Yeah, you know, as they say, no Jews, no news. You know, they only care if Israel does something bad. That's the only time that they go out onto the streets and protests. You know, one of the points I make in my book, there's a chapter about the keffiyeh, the kind of Palestinian scarf that has become a fashion accessory in the West. And I make the point that most of those keffiyehs you see on the streets of our cities were mass-produced in China by people who get paid very badly and have no rights and no freedoms, including Uyghurs. Yeah. Uyghurs work in some of these factories that make the keffiyeh. So you have privileged Westerners going around with a scarf that was made by genuinely oppressed people who have no rights at all to show their solidarity with Palestinians. I mean, it is the most hypocritical thing. But, you know, you said earlier it's not racist to criticize Israel. Absolutely right. But what's happening now, and what's been happening since 7th of October, is not criticism of Israel. It is a blind, boiling hatred for Israel. Yeah. It is a demand for Israel's destruction. It is the treatment of Israel by a different standard to which every other nation in the world is held. And it is people on the streets of our towns and cities saying that this one state must be excised from the world in order to bring about peace. That's not criticism. That's bigotry. Yeah. That's not an analysis, it's racism. So the thin line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, that is something we really need to get serious. That
has certainly been blurred. And again, that's the title of the book, and it's got a bloody handprint on it's very powerful front cover after the pogrom. Of course, a Russian word about the massacres of Jews in Russia. It's a great book. I genuinely think that, honestly, if you've got someone in your family who is completely justifying what Hamas has done or what Hezbollah has done, buy them this book, tell them to read it, say, I'll have a discussion afterwards, because I think it might change some minds. After the pogrom, 7th of October, Israel and the Crisis of Civilization by Brendon O'Neill. Really appreciate you joining us, Brendon.